A wealthy businessman with a secret. A married man living a double life. A wife who may have known more than she admitted, and a brutal murder that remains unsolved to this day. On a cold night in 2002, Ethan Reynolds was found stabbed to death in his upscale apartment. No signs of forced entry, no murder weapon. And two people with everything to lose, his secret gay lover, Mark Sullivan, and Mark's wife, Laura. They had the motive. They had the opportunity. But the truth? That vanished the moment Ethan took his last breath. Who killed Ethan Reynolds? And how did they get away with it? This is the story of deception, betrayal, and a murder that still haunts those who knew him. Welcome to A Secret Affair Gone Wrong, the murder of Ethan Reynolds. Ethan Reynolds was the embodiment of success, an accomplished real estate developer with an eye for opportunity and a reputation for excellence. He moved through life with quiet confidence, admired by colleagues and loved by friends. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, Ethan was a man of mystery. He guarded his personal life fiercely, revealing little about his private affairs. Mark Sullivan, on the other hand, was the picture of stability. A well-respected city official, a devoted husband, and a father, his name was synonymous with integrity. But behind the carefully curated image of a family man, Mark harbored a secret, one that few knew and even fewer understood. He and Ethan shared a connection that defied the expectations of their world. It was a relationship built on passion and risk, hidden in the shadows of their separate lives. And in the end, it was a secret that may have cost Ethan everything. Their paths first crossed in the exclusive world of business and politics, a space where ambition and power mingled freely, where deals were made with firm handshakes and knowing glances. Ethan Reynolds, ever the opportunist, had a keen eye for potential partnerships, and Mark Sullivan, a rising figure in city government, was no exception. Initially, their meetings were professional. Their conversations focused on real estate developments, zoning laws, and lucrative projects that would benefit them both. But somewhere between the boardroom discussions and casual networking events, something changed. What began as business acquaintanceship turned into something else, a hidden, electrifying connection neither man had anticipated. It was a relationship built in stolen moments and whispered phone calls, in quiet dinners behind tinted windows and late-night visits where the world couldn't see. To the public, Mark was a devoted husband, a family man with everything to lose. To Ethan, he was something more, a lover trapped in a life he no longer wanted, yet couldn't escape. For a while, secrecy was their ally. Mark was meticulous, always ensuring that no trace of their relationship could be found. But Ethan was different. He wanted more time, more commitment, more than just a hidden romance confined to secrecy and shadows, and that's where the tension began. Mark was terrified of what would happen if the truth ever came out. Everything was at stake in his career, his marriage, his entire reputation. A single slip, a single moment of carelessness, and the life he had built would come crashing down. But Ethan, ever ambitious, ever unafraid, began pushing the boundaries of their arrangement. He didn't want to be a secret anymore, and that made Mark desperate. Then came the breaking point. Laura Sullivan, Mark's wife, was a woman of sharp intuition. For years she had stood by his side, supporting his career, raising their children, and maintaining the image of a perfect marriage. But perfection is often an illusion, and as much as Mark tried to hide his secret, the truth had a way of creeping to the surface. At first, it was just suspicion. Late nights at the office, sudden unexplained absences, the distant look in her husband's eyes. But soon, suspicion turned into certainty. An anonymous text message arrived on her phone, brief and cutting. "Your husband isn't who you think he is." It was followed by details, times, places, undeniable proof that Mark had been leading a double life. And then, there was the receipt. A single hotel transaction was found crumpled in his pocket, and from a night, Mark had sworn he was out of town on business. But the most damning piece of all? The phone records. Repeated calls and messages to a number Laura didn't recognize, Ethan Reynolds' number. What happened next remains shrouded in rumor and speculation, but those close to the Sullivans claim Laura confronted Mark in a fit of quiet rage. Some say she demanded answers. Others believe she went further, giving him an ultimatum: end the affair or face the consequences. There are even whispers that she threatened to expose him publicly, to ruin his career and take everything he held dear. Whatever words were spoken behind closed doors that night, one thing is certain: from that moment on, the fragile world Ethan and Mark had built began to collapse. And soon, one of them would be dead. In the days leading up to his death, Ethan Reynolds was not himself. Friends and colleagues later recalled the subtle but noticeable change. His usual confidence had given way to unease. He had always been a man in control, navigating the complexities of business and personal life with precision. But something was different now. He was restless, distracted, and even paranoid at times. His phone rang more frequently, and when he answered, his tone was hushed, his responses curt. He canceled meetings, avoided social gatherings, and, most telling of all, he began looking over his shoulder as if he sensed something, or someone, closing in on him. Those closest to him speculated that the walls were closing in. Had Mark finally given in to the pressure? Had Laura followed through on her threats? Or was it something even darker? Something Ethan hadn't foreseen. On the night of his murder, surveillance cameras captured Ethan entering his upscale apartment at exactly 9:30 p.m. He was alone, dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He walked with purpose but paused briefly before stepping inside, glancing down the hallway as if expecting to see someone there. Then he disappeared behind the door, and was never seen alive again. What happened inside that apartment remains a mystery, but when authorities arrived the next morning, they found a scene that spoke of violence, of rage, of a struggle for survival. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, glass shattered, signs of a fight that had lasted more than just a few seconds. Ethan had fought back. He had tried to escape, but his killer had been relentless. The autopsy report would later confirm the brutality of the attack. Multiple stab wounds, deep and precise, had been inflicted across his chest and abdomen. These were not the marks of a robbery gone wrong. The wounds told a different story. This was personal, fueled by emotion, by betrayal, by something deeper than mere opportunity. It was a killing driven by fury. The immediate question was clear: who had a motive? Who had the most to gain by silencing Ethan Reynolds? Mark Sullivan was the first name to surface. As Ethan's secret lover, he had the most to lose if their relationship became public. With his marriage on the brink, his career hanging in the balance, and the weight of Laura's possible threats pressing down on him, was this his way out? Had Mark, in a moment of desperation, chosen the unthinkable, to end Ethan's life before Ethan could ruin his? Then there was Laura, the scorned wife, the woman who had built her life around a man she now realized had betrayed her. Did she act in a fit of passion, unable to bear the humiliation of Mark's deception? Or was this something more calculated, an act of cold revenge against the man she believed had destroyed her marriage? But there was also a third possibility, one even more chilling. Had someone else been involved? Had a third party, someone acting on behalf of Mark or Laura, been the one to deliver the final blow? A hired hand, ensuring that Ethan would never again threaten the life they had worked so hard to maintain? Despite the speculation, one thing was certain: Ethan Reynolds had been silenced. But by whom? And why? The answers lay hidden in the tangled web of lies, betrayal, and secrecy that surrounded his final days. And as investigators began to unravel the truth, they would find themselves facing more questions than answers. As detectives began piecing together the final moments of Ethan Reynolds' life, they turned their focus to the two people with the most motive: Mark and Laura Sullivan. Both were questioned extensively and both provided alibis. But from the very beginning, something wasn't right. Mark Sullivan claimed he was home the entire night of the murder, spending the evening with Laura before going to bed around 10 p.m. His story was simple and unwavering. He was with his wife, and there was no way he could have been involved in Ethan's death. But when pressed for details, his responses became vague. What movie had they watched? What time had they gone to bed? Did he remember hearing his wife get up? His answers were inconsistent. riddled with hesitation, as though he was trying too hard to recall a night that should have been unremarkable. Laura Sullivan's story was even more peculiar. She told investigators she had gone to bed early, exhausted from the emotional strain of the past few weeks. She had been asleep the entire night and knew nothing about Ethan's murder until the next morning. But when detectives checked her phone records, they found something troubling. At 10:47 p.m., around the estimated time of Ethan's murder, a call had been placed from her phone to an unknown number, a call that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Who had she spoken to, and why had she failed to mention it? When confronted with this evidence, Laura didn't flinch. She dismissed the call as insignificant, a simple misdial, or perhaps a call she had no recollection of making. But detectives weren't convinced. If Laura had been asleep, who had used her phone? And if she was awake, what had she been discussing at the very moment Ethan was being murdered? The deeper investigators dug, the more inconsistencies they found. There was no sign of forced entry at Ethan's apartment. The front door had been locked, meaning whoever had entered that night had either been let in or had a key. This led to a chilling realization: Ethan had likely known his killer. Then there was the missing murder weapon. The forensic team determined that Ethan had been stabbed multiple times with a sharp, narrow blade, perhaps a kitchen knife or a small hunting blade. But despite extensive searches, the weapon was never recovered. It hadn't been left at the crime scene. Whoever killed Ethan had taken it with them, ensuring that one of the most crucial pieces of evidence would never be found. With no witnesses and no physical evidence tying them directly to the crime, the investigation leaned heavily on Mark and Laura's statements. But their stories didn't match. There were gaps, contradictions, and a growing sense that they were hiding something. Detectives brought Mark in for questioning first. The once composed city official appeared visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. He insisted on his innocence, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I loved him. I would never hurt him." But love and desperation are not always separate. Was Mark clinging to the memory of a man he had lost, or was he covering up a crime committed in fear of losing everything? Laura's interrogation was starkly different. While her husband showed emotion, she remained cool, calculated, almost detached. She listened intently to each question before responding in a measured tone, carefully choosing her words. When asked directly if she had anything to do with Ethan's murder, she simply said, "I had nothing to do with their mess." Their mess. It was an odd way to phrase it, cold, distant, as if she were talking about something beneath her concern. Detectives took note. Laura had not denied knowledge of the affair. She had not expressed shock or grief over Ethan's death. Instead, she had spoken of it as though it were an inconvenience, a problem that had now been dealt with. But without direct evidence, suspicions alone were not enough to make an arrest. The case, despite all its unanswered questions, began to stall. The missing murder weapon, the conflicting alibis, the unanswered call at the time of the murder. It was all circumstantial, enough to raise red flags, but not enough to convict. And so, after hours of interrogation, after relentless questioning and cross-examination, both Mark and Laura Sullivan walked out of the police station, free but under the heavy shadow of doubt. The world watched, waiting for justice. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to years, it became clear justice might never come. With no arrests and no clear answers, the case of Ethan Reynolds' murder became one of speculation, rumor, and chilling theories. Investigators, journalists, and the public alike began piecing together what might have happened in that apartment on the night of his death. And while no definitive proof ever surfaced, 3 dominant theories emerged, each one as unsettling as the next. Of all the theories, the most immediate and emotionally charged was this. Laura Sullivan, consumed by jealousy and betrayal, had confronted Ethan, and things had turned deadly. By the time of his murder, it was no secret that Laura knew about the affair. The anonymous messages, the hotel receipt, the phone records, they had all led her straight to the truth. Some sources close to the Sullivan family claimed that Laura had confided in a friend, expressing her devastation, her anger, and, most notably, her desire to make things right. But what did she mean by that? Jealousy is a powerful emotion, one that can push people to the edge. Had Laura, in a moment of rage, gone to Ethan's apartment that night? Did she confront him, demanding that he leave her husband alone? And when Ethan, ever defiant, refused, had she lashed out? The crime scene suggested a struggle. Furniture overturned, shattered glass, the signs of a fight that escalated beyond control. Was this the moment that ended Ethan's life? But if Laura had killed Ethan in the heat of passion, how had she covered her tracks so well? There was no murder weapon, no physical evidence linking her to the scene. And then there was the phone call, the mysterious one made from her phone around the time of the murder. If she had been in Ethan's apartment, who had she called? Or had she called someone to help her? The second theory was just as chilling, but with a different motive. Mark Sullivan himself had killed Ethan, not in a moment of rage, but out of desperation, to silence a man who had become a threat. Ethan had always wanted more. The secrecy, the hiding, the constant fear of being caught, it wasn't enough for him. Friends recalled that in the weeks before his death, Ethan had seemed frustrated, even impatient. Had he finally given Mark an ultimatum? Leave Laura, or I'll tell her myself. For a man like Mark, the stakes were impossibly high. He wasn't just a husband, he was a respected city official, a man with influence, a career that hinged on public perception. If word of his affair leaked, it wouldn't just ruin his marriage, it could destroy everything he had worked for. The fallout would be catastrophic. And maybe, just maybe, he saw only one way out. Could Mark have gone to Ethan that night, not to reason with him, but to eliminate the problem? The signs of struggle suggested that Ethan had fought back. If Mark had brought a knife, perhaps planning to threaten him rather than kill him, would the confrontation have turned deadly? Or was it planned from the beginning? There was something else, too. Mark's alibi had always been fragile. He claimed he was home with Laura, but Laura had already been caught in a lie. If Laura's alibi was weak, then Mark's was even weaker. Had they both lied to protect him? Or was she in the dark about his involvement, covering for a man who had already made the ultimate decision? And yet, the biggest problem with this theory was the same as before: no physical evidence. No bloodstains, no weapon, nothing directly linking Mark to the crime. Without a confession, detectives had no way to prove his involvement. But then came the third, and perhaps most terrifying theory of all, that neither Mark nor Laura had committed the murder themselves. Instead, someone else had done it for them. Could Laura have been the mastermind orchestrating Ethan's death to rid herself of a threat she couldn't control? The phone call from her device at the time of the murder had always been a mystery. If she had called someone, an unknown number, was it to give the final instruction? To make sure the job was done? Or was Mark the one who had set the plan in motion? Perhaps he had broken under Ethan's pressure, knowing that exposure was inevitable. Perhaps he had reached out to someone who could take care of the problem while keeping his own hands clean. A hired professional, ensuring that there would be no direct link back to him. If this theory was true, it would explain why the murder weapon was never found. A hired killer wouldn't leave behind evidence. A hired killer wouldn't make mistakes. But it also raised a troubling question. If Mark or Laura had hired someone to kill Ethan, who was it? And why had investigators never found them? Despite the rumors, despite the suspicion, despite the glaring inconsistencies in their stories, Mark and Laura Sullivan were never arrested. And the reason? A lack of hard evidence. There were too many missing pieces, too many unanswered questions. No fingerprints at the crime scene pointed to an intruder. No security footage showed anyone entering Ethan's apartment that night, only Ethan himself. No weapon was ever found. And crucially, no one broke. Neither Mark nor Laura ever confessed, and without that confession, the case remained just that. A case, not a conviction. Mark's emotional yet defensive stance, his repeated insistence that he loved Ethan and would never hurt him, wasn't enough to indict him. Laura's cold, calculated demeanor and her chilling words about having nothing to do with their mess raised red flags but provided no proof. And without proof, the justice system was powerless. As time passed, the case grew colder. Investigators moved on. The public, though haunted by the tragedy, slowly let the headlines fade. And Mark and Laura Sullivan, they walked away, free, but forever under suspicion. To this day, the murder of Ethan Reynolds remains unsolved. A crime of passion? A desperate cover-up? A calculated hit? The truth lies buried somewhere within the secrets of that night. But one thing is certain, whoever took Ethan's life got away with it. Ethan Reynolds was more than just a name in a headline. He was more than the scandal, more than the secrets, more than the betrayal that ultimately defined the end of his life. He was a son, a friend, a man with dreams, ambitions, and a future that should never have been stolen from him. Yet his story remains unfinished, buried beneath a tangle of lies, conflicting alibis, and the eerie silence of those who know the truth, but refuse to speak. Justice was never served. The questions surrounding his murder were never answered. And somewhere, the person or people responsible for his death are still walking free, untouched by the weight of their actions. That is the cruelest part of this story. Not just that Ethan Reynolds was taken too soon, but that his killer was never held accountable. Cases like Ethan's remind us of the terrifying reality that sometimes justice isn't guaranteed, that the truth can be hidden in plain sight, locked behind closed doors, whispered only in places where no one is listening. But as long as we remember, as long as we continue to ask questions, to demand answers, to refuse to let the silence win, then maybe, just maybe one day, the truth will come to light. If you believe that stories like Ethan's deserve to be told, if you believe that no case should be forgotten, then help us keep the conversation going. Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime investigations, more stories of injustice, and more mysteries that demand to be solved. Because somewhere out there, justice is still waiting.